Last Stand, The Battle for Moscow, 1941-1942. This is a war game that was published in Japan in 2008. Now we have an English language version published by MMP. And, well, the title gives it away, tells you the topic. We are in this fateful moment of World War II and really of human history. History could have gone so differently if the Germans had taken Moscow in that winter, 1941-1942, and basically had won the war against the Soviet Union. So it's a two-player game in which the two players will take the control of the Germans and the Soviets respectively. However, the game is also perfectly playable in solitaire by a single player controlling both sides at the best of their possibilities. There are some limited knowledge, fog of war, limited information elements when it comes to victory conditions, but you can easily adjust things to your liking. I personally play the game only in solitaire. We're in times of COVID, so I cannot play with a human opponent. I play both sides, best of my possibilities, and I actually had a really good time. So sorry for the spoiler about the conclusions there. The map is printed on paper. It's a single map, so it's very manageable. You're not gonna need too much room for that, and it has a certain old school feel to it. The topic, the general handling of things, it's very reminiscent to me of Battle for Moscow. Also, you will see untried Russian units. That's also something similar from that classic game, but it is kind of different. Anyways, Battle for Moscow for a new generation, maybe. So this is what the map looks like. Lots of player rates here on the side. That's very good and very useful. The campaign game, the main scenario starts with the Germans here, of course, forming a front here. And there is a line of Soviet units just facing them, trying to oppose them. So a player don't get to attach to those units because they'll be annihilated early on, a lot of them. It's about handling pain, of course, in the early phases of the game. And the Germans will push. There will be garrisons, a couple of other units scattered around here, but again, mainly you have a front here that disgregate, that get blown to bits early on, and then reinforcements come in. The weather becomes your friend, as different rules will handle rain, snow, frozen, let it go, because it's going to be pretty intense fight. Entrenchment, so everything plays in your advantage, Soviet player, after the initial horrible pain. Now, something I want to point out right away, the supply system, because I like it very, very much. Now, you may notice here on the side of the board, next to the initial German line, supply sources. Nothing extraordinary there, but for the fact that the supply sources are labeled. They're not just generic supply sources for the German player, but they are for specific groups. Say we have the 3rd Panzer, the 4th, the 4th Panzer, and so on and so forth. That means that units also belong to these groups, and they, as indicated by the color of the icon on their counter. To be in supply, a unit needs to be able to trace a line of supply of 8 hexes directly to its own source, so that doesn't get you all that far, or to a supply unit of that group. So you can, for example, trace a line of up to 8 hexes to that supply unit, which then can trace an unlimited line of supply to a supply source, of course, free of enemy units and enemy zones of control. Units that have that white area that you see there are motorized, which is super important for movement purposes. Units, because they just behave differently from foot units. And the stats that you have here are attack, defense, and movement. Pretty classic. So you will want your fronts to pretty much well, again, as a German player, you can split your front, send them in different directions, but not too many crazy maneuvers because, again, the supply lines are specific. It's also interesting that if you really feel that you have bountiful supply units, you can convert the supply units that just gives you supply, preventing penalties, into an attack supply. You flip it to this side, it will give you a bonus in the upcoming combat phase when you attack only, not in defense, but then it is removed. And there's a schedule on the turn track that tells you how many supply units as the German player you receive, and you can choose which supply units you bring into play. So you decide where you can push more and what are the areas of the board that become a little more dormant, maybe. Very interesting decisions there. So we got units for both sides. For the Germans, again, they look a little more traditional. The units for the Soviet player will look familiar to if you play Battle for Moscow or other games that use the idea of untried units. As you can see, there is the movement factor there, so you know how far they can go, but you just don't know how good they are in combat until they are involved in combat. You know if they're infantry, if they are armor, they're also cavalry. But again, you basically flip all of these units face down this way so that only this side is showing. You shuffle them and then you set them up according to type. But again, you do not know the specific stats of each unit. The Soviet player also has headquarters that have the same function as the supply units. So again, the Soviet player can draw supply lines to the supply sources directly, but very short, or to headquarters, which then in turn need to trace to supply sources. The Soviet player also has garrisons that will be placed in specific towns, and they offer a modest defense. If destroyed, they create Soviet damage. Suffice to say, the more of these are in the Soviet damage box, the worse things are for the Soviet player. So, each turn, what happens? So there is a weather determination, and then you have a couple of upkeep functions. It's easier if you just look at them and you get a sense. If you're a seasoned war gamer, more or less you know most of these things. You check how many air power points you received. You can use those to get advantage in combat. Supply, isolation for units that were supplied, and so on and so forth. And then the main idea really is move and fight. Nothing too exotic there. After that, the Soviets get a reaction phase in which they can move some of their units, and then the Germans get an exploit movement phase in which they can move all units that are not in an enemy zone of control and that are not affected by negative situations such as being isolated or out of supply. The Soviet turn is similar. They also have a supply phase with those upkeep functions. Then, however, here's interesting. As you can see, the sequence is slightly different. The Germans get to move and attack before the Soviets, they get to react, and then they suffer an exploitation. The Soviets move, then they cross their fingers, the Germans react, and only after the Soviets see how the Germans reacted and perform limited reaction movement, only then can they resolve combat. And finally, they also get exploitation. They also get a second phase of movement. Movement is, I think you know how it works. You move. That's it. Up to your full movement allowance, different types of terrain cost different amounts of points. Each unit, combat unit, project a zone of control, which has no effect as you enter it, but it costs 3 extra movement points, which is a lot, to move away from. And most units cannot move from one zone of control to another. They cannot perform infiltration movement. The idea of how sticky zones of control are is important because you have other games about this topic or about the Eastern Front, in which basically, yes, the Soviet units suffered the brunt of the first attack, and then they're like, you know what? Screw this, I'm out of here, I'm just leaving. And they just run behind the next entrenchment, behind the next river. They just can go as far as they want. Not so quick, Buster, because as you exit those zones of control, you cannot go all that far. And There may be other reasons, but to me, the effect that this specific effect of zone of control has, the way in which I found it really impacted the game to me, is in making it harder for the Soviets to retreat behind a valuable kind of terrain for defensive purposes. So it creates a little bit of a somewhat no retreat or no retreat much kind of situation. For the Germans, it's not that important because you're closing in and you're going to punch them in the face. So it's not, pound them in the face, it's not that important to be able to move away from the Soviet units. So we move, take zones of control into account. As you move, you can also perform overrun attacks, which is part of combat. And I really like the elegance of this. Basically, regular combat and overrun combat are resolved in exactly the same way, as you will see, but regular combat is resolved rolling a 6-sided die and checking a combat table, and overrun rolling a 10-sided die and checking a combat table. So different areas are activated. You don't have to think about a lot of different rules and modifiers. You just pick up a different die and you resolve overrun or regular combat. I love that idea. Another interesting idea of the combat system, which I find of great elegance, is how terrain effects for combat are resolved by giving you a different connections between the columns of the combat table and different kinds of terrain. Combat is resolved in the traditional way. You put together all of the attack factors of the attacker and the defense factors of the defender, divide one by the other so that you have a ratio. The attacker is attacking a 3-to-1, 2-to-1, such and such and such. And you look at the corresponding column, then you will roll a die. Which one depends on the type of attack. Cross-reference the column and the result, and then you read the result. But again, how you find the column depends on the terrain, and I love that, because again, I don't have to worry about too many rules. It's a city, marsh, town, forest, that's it. That tells me where I need to go. I love it. As for the results, L means mandatory loss of a step, R means mandatory retreat. When you find a number, and the results on the left of the slash apply to the attacker, the ones on the right apply to the defender. If you find a number, that number means a penalty, well, a negative outcome that you can choose to pay for as a retreat or as a loss. So for example, here we have a mandatory loss indicated by the L and another penalty, let's call it that way, that you can take as a second loss or as a retreat. This one too that you can pay as retreats or as losses. Advance of the combat is based on how much you retreated. If you took a lot of losses, then you were just standing there holding your ground. You died, but the opponent doesn't have a lot of time to advance. Because retreat, the more you retreat, then the more advance of the combat abilities you give to the opponent. Again, you see, it looks like an overwhelming combat table, but there's a lot that has been hardwired and streamlined for you here. So you continue turn after turn until the end of the game. Victory conditions, I'm not going to get into details because there are different ways in which the game go. Suffice to say, as the Germans try to destroy a lot of units, do not take too many losses and try to take Moscow, and if you do so, you'll probably win the game. If, as the Soviet, you prevent the big onslaught or the march towards Moscow, you can slow it down, you can prevent the German player from taking control of too many cities, then most likely you will win the game. The Last Stand is a game that looks familiar. It has many similarities with Battle for Moscow and with other games. It has a strong old school feel to it. But everything is executed very well. With the exception of the rulebook, I think it could have been cleaned up and just tied it up a little bit. Other than that, the production is nice. Quality of the kind that we expect from MMP with functional maps, very readable counters. But again, the execution, those ideas, they're untried. Soviet Union, combat odds, oh, I've never seen those. Yes, I've seen them, and so have you. Even if you're a beginner war gamer, chances are you have calculated 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 at some point in the 2 war games that you play, chances are one of them had that. So everything is very familiar, but to me this is a strength when it feels familiar but not routine. It's executed well and presents interesting challenges, interesting ideas. And then there are those innovative, or at least to me unusual, touches that all bring those elegant shortcuts, say, to how terrain works. I don't have to worry about combat, looking on the combat table, what are the effects of combat for that thing. Is right there already hardwired in the combat table. I don't need to look at the play rate and then translate that to the combat table. The idea that the columns work differently based on terrain, mind blowing. I really enjoyed that. Or supplies. I like the fact of individual supplies for the individual groups, which usually may feel burdensome in terms of logistics, by which I mean my logistics of keeping track of counters, not necessarily the logistics of the people in the story. But it works so well, it works so naturally. And it places real burdens, real interesting dilemmas, especially on the German player. Because the temptation of burning one of those supplies for a mega attack that gives you that breakthrough, gives you an encirclement, it's really tempting, but you will pay that dearly later. And again, in a sense, everything looks familiar. You know the general architecture of the situation, which, however, does not feel scripted. As a German player, you know you have a ton of advantage at the beginning. You're just going to punch through that line, encircle units, devastate the defenders, and yet somehow they keep coming. They keep showing up like mushrooms here and there. And somehow you lose momentum because winter is coming, and then winter comes, and they keep getting more reinforcements, and you get just a little dent here in your armor, a little dent there, people look a little bit tired, but every single step that is lost for the German player after a while starts adding up, and at some point you find yourself so close to Moscow, in need of that final desperate push, and yet getting there is not that easy. Again, the terrain becomes more forgiving for the Soviet player the closer you get to Moscow. So you have the general architecture that you come to expect from a game with this topic, but within that architecture, you have so many different choices, so many things in which you can handle your advance, and which parts of the front will push first, and which ones will stay behind, how you will prevent the front from stretching, etc., etc., etc. So many interesting decisions for the Soviet player. As I said, this is a 2-player game that you can also play solitaire, but I don't think I will ever want to be the Soviet player, or will want to have a friend of mine being the Soviet player. I believe this game does work better when you play the game by yourself. You kind of think of yourself controlling the German side, and the Soviet side, there's still interesting things to do, but they're almost automatized. It's almost an AI. I don't think that a human player, again, there will be choices there, but I don't think I want to sit there, see you, the German player, destroy my line, and then I have these like 5 units and I have to decide where to place them. And because of your sticky zones of control, I don't get to move them back as much as I would like, to reform them around all that much. So I really see this as functionally, although technically it's a multiplayer game, functionally as a single-player game that works very well. Oh my gosh, so much fun as the German player against those unknown Soviet units. And it's fun to discover what those defenders do. Again, I think it would be pretty annoying if I was the Soviet player and I'm still attempting some counterattacks or something, and I don't know my Soviet units, I don't know what they do, and the values turn out to be very bad. It's fun as the German, can be pretty frustrating, I believe, if you are the Soviet player. So it's a game that relies on a solid tradition of concepts from wargaming. It has some interesting new touches here and there, say the different die for the overrun, and those touches are all streamlined and elegant. There are interesting interactions between the two sides, the fact that each side has some agency during the opponent's side, but yet to me, the Soviet side just, I don't think it's going to be all that interesting to play. I would not enjoy playing if that is all I was doing here. If it's what I'm doing when I'm not the German player, it's perfectly fine. The game works very well as a solitaire game. And again, if you get past the rule book, which has some gray areas here and there, it may look more daunting than it is. I think it's a game that can be played by a beginner or gamer. So Last Stand makes for an excellent solitaire study and solitaire game about such a momentous, such an interesting topic. You have the challenges that the people in history faced at that time, and that creates for an interesting dilemma for a very tense situation. So overall, I'm very pleased with Last Stand, The Battle for Moscow, 1941-1942. And especially in these times of pandemic, where maybe you struggle to find a human opponent for your wargaming needs, this could definitely be a good option.